question, and that's why I sought to set that up, is, of course, the question to find out what that means for architecture or urban planning. How can that inform possibly different way of designing or thinking about designing, and a way of a different representation of that what one designs. I mean, in DIP3 we are trying for a while to enroll the process of designing from a different, in a different way, by looking at processes and looking at memory and trying to find out how much memory could define visions or possibilities, or however one would call that, for the future. What influenced me once enormously was Chris Marquet's La Jetée, the 30-minute film, which we have shown here several times before, and I think I didn't show it this year because I was told by several people, not again La Jetée, but I hope everybody knows. But I mean, in that process, the La Jetée deals with the question how one, it's after the Third World War and a nuclear disastrous battle, and Paris is destroyed, and people, survivors, are living underground, the catacombs of Paris, and the question is, there's no chance to get out, and the question is, how can one survive, and or how can one get into the future to find out what the possibilities are for surviving. So are those experiments that scientists are trying to transfer the protagonist back into the past, and by doing that, that fails first, and it finally leads to a certain stage, and he goes back, and the result in the end, if I'm right, and who is a specialist, and Chris Marquet may correct me, is that the moment he discovers his childhood, or let's say his personality, I would say he dies. That's true. And I mean, with processes in architecture, it's so difficult to define them or to predict them, whether it's a city or whether it's a house. It's very difficult, and that's why because it's constantly changing, and a door is not a door. A door is nothing without something which makes it into a piece of memory. Otherwise, it's just a piece of wood or metal which opens and closes. That's what I think, for example. But then, how can one integrate into architecture the widest range of possibilities of movement and of the possibility to relate it to memory, in that sense that it becomes a meaning? I mean, when Marx says, and I hope I understand Marx right, that there is not the new, that there is only the lost object of the negative space. I know I'm a simplificateur terrible. So in which way can one look at physicality, for example, that it doesn't become just a battle of material, that one reduces the physicality to that, how much meaning it may be able to carry? That's one of the questions. The other question is that the thing which I mentioned several times, which where I struggle like hell, is the Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, what I mentioned before, the impossibility of defining space and time simultaneously. Because whenever one makes a decision, this decision can only be made according to a statement which one has formulated, and that's it. But that doesn't include processes which could define that further. So I'm just saying that's a conflict, which is of course related for me to life processes, and that's why I think, for example, film is a means to transport that, because it's, or moving images, better said, it's the only means which are combining processes with spaces, or time with space. So there's a obvious relation between those aspects. But that is not that clear or simple or straight. That is the big problem again with that, to identify causalities or relation between processes and spaces. So I will stop at the moment here and possibly get the beeping from the other speakers or from Martin, Sherman, you.
Since we wanted to maybe begin with some of this relationship question, just it would be useful if you could elaborate a little bit more what you were saying about the connection between a piece of wood and the door and the memory of the door. In the way that you see this connection, what happens between the moment when something is a piece of wood and the time when it becomes the memory of the door? What is actually involved in that gap, in that space for you? I think it would be useful if you could somehow say something more how you see that.
Materiality or physicality, whatever of those, I believe they have no memory content by itself. Even they have a shape, they don't. It is only possible that they get a memory content by events someone is involved in. Of course, in a way they get a kind of historic memory from the process of the tree growing and cutting the tree and fabricating the door and making hinges on it and the lock and decide how big it is. But still that doesn't mean anything except I have the experience, a special experience. Like for me it was important to find out that, let me say several events. One event is the Nazis made doors they found important about 10 meters, 8 to 10 meters high, out of oak normally, which is seen very much as a German tree with a meaning, the history of Germany, and it was for a kid impossible to open such a door. It was very difficult to open that door for an adult. But so I started thinking with that experience, why is that so big? Of course, it's, I guess there's one thing to make a human being feeling small. But I mean, what I want to say is that experience that I couldn't open that door and that it was so big was one experience which caused a memory, and for me then big doors had to do with that memory that it is about that people should feel small. Another memory I have is with the actress Romy Schneider. We were talking and walking towards a building, and she was carrying her baby, and she was turning around trying to tell me something, and that was just in front of a glass facade with a glass door. So she did run into that glass door, and of course got unconscious. But I was behind her, so I could hold her and the baby. But from that point on, glass doors for me were connected with a certain danger that they divide spaces, but at the same time they are not identifiable, and so on and so on. So on that level, I mean, so. But the decision whether one does a glass door, a 10-meter high door, or normal door, or what is a normal door, or what is a normal size, or what is an appropriate material, how can one do that except from possibly personal experiences, decide from personal experiences, but how do you know that that is the right door for other people, for example?
I'm not sure that I agree with you, because it seems that while I think that there is this moment when the architectural project does take on this memory and all these things that are assigned to it in terms of personal memory, it seems that the material wood itself, on one level, has also certain possibilities that are part and parcel of its qualities and its characteristics that could be utilized in many different ways. And these possibilities are the things that are in some way kind of dormant in that material, open to all sorts of experimentation. So the door is both that aspect that can take on that memory, but it's also something that is constructed in certain ways. Through its construction and its situation, it also establishes certain kinds of relations that it constructs as a door. And then it also is part of maybe our personal memories in many different ways. So I'm trying to find a way in which the understanding of this idea of the door, in a way, as a kind of situation, going back to some of the things that have been mentioned about Gilles Deleuze, somehow, is there a possibility that one can move from situation to action? You know, that's one of the kind of titles that he has. And I think that might be one of the things that in the context of the school, it would be interesting maybe to try and touch on in parallel with some of the things that have been also discussed about film. How is it possible to go from situation to action?
You asked me.
Well, no, I mean,
I give the answer.
I think that's one of the things that we've set up as part of the as part of the debate. And I think one of the things that's been fantastic is that we have really been, in a way, inspired by so many of the movies. And you can see on this panel there seems to be greater number of people who are speaking about film than those who are speaking about architecture. And that's part of our problem, in a way. If you had very good examples of people who were doing architectography right now, I'm sure you would have them on this panel, but presumably you had a harder time finding, people who are doing that in a way. So I think this is the kind of problematic that now requires the kind of contribution of the people around the table, and I think it's kind of interesting for us. Well, the whole point of this thing about architectography and cinematecture is presumably that it's not a dialectical condition, but it's actually what I said this morning, is this kind of diatactical where you can go from one to the other. You don't want to make it sort of only a one-way deal. Either way, somewhere.
I just were thinking about Dan Graham, who is originally an architect and who no, isn't he?
Well, okay, yeah.
But he did in his installation, video installation, mirror installation, and his dispositif, I would say, he was reflecting a lot on the relationship between architecture and visual spaces and cinema too. So this would be the other way. We
He
didn't
just took down an exhibition upstairs on the terrace, which he made here last year, so I don't know what people thought about it. John was going to say something.
I think that everybody here at school knows that Pascal is a sort of wrestler. He always fights against the physicality of architecture. So how could we understand his position? I think that if we remind the way the cinema is fabricating films, we could remind that, first of all, before the cinema, there are movements and perception of movements. Then there is the specific understanding of movement from a first notion of time, which is the measure of the diversity of the movements. Then there is the invention of cinema, and the cinema brings an engine, a motor, to fabricate in a new way new movements and to relate its own movement to the movements of the outside, the movements of the world. And at the end, what is the result of those perceptions and operations? The experience of time as releasing us from the movement. So it's a sort of percolation. It's a sort of an experience of shrinking, an experience of an essential reduction. So if I compare these invention, if I compare these fabrication of cinema with the fabrication of architecture, it could be possible to say that, of course, architecture is involved with physicality, with materials, architecture reacts to the materiality of the world. Architecture fabricates materials from its own. But at the end, architecture, for instance, fabricates shelters which release us from the constraints and the servitude of materiality, physicality, etc. So I think that the insistence that Pascal has about the non-physicality of architecture is a sort of personal vision of the end of architecture, of the end of architecture, dealing with fabricating, shrinking everything in its own form and shape, but achieving something which is out of movements, materiality, etc. It's the same thing in philosophy. If it's possible to say that the aim of philosophy is to release the thinker from the force of the judgment, it is quite impossible to understand that. But it's not Deleuze said, for instance, because everything has the same value than anything else. It is because each thing which has a value tends to suspend the judgment. So I think that something in the cinema, in the fabrication of the cinema, tends to suspend the experience of movement in order to make an intuition of time possible. And architecture, there is something similar, and in philosophy, there is something similar. So there is a difference between the fabrication as using different things as means, and the aim of this fabrication, and it's impossible to achieve the process of the fabrication without or in losing this specific aim. So it's quite paradoxical, of course, but I think that we have to learn a lot from the cinema. It's absolutely amazing to see in what extent cinema uses movements, perception of movements, complexity of movements, but to do what? To make a certain perception of time possible. And I believe that there is a sort of connection between this philosophy about intuition of pure time and the very ancient statement by Plato saying that time is some mobile image of eternity. So time is a sort of connection between something which is always altered by movement and something which overcomes the constraints of movements. So I think it's possible to speculate from those comparisons between the fabrication of images in the cinema and the fabrication of buildings or shelters or places by architecture.
seems to me that before kind of Moisen's question can be kind of answered, how would a concern run from kind of film to architecture? It is indeed very easy to see how architecture can be kind of swallowed by film. Maybe like some of the terms that are used need to be kind of slightly clarified. Obviously, one way in which, and this is not Pascal's way in which there's a movement from film to architecture, is simply to kind of assert in a quite cynical way that architecture itself is becoming much more kind of image-based. It is mediated through images, and therefore, in a sense, it ought to borrow techniques, cinematic techniques from kind of collaging, kind of montage, whatever, as a direct translation into kind of built form. Now, obviously, that's not kind of what's at stake. That, nevertheless, there seem to me to be, some issues which I think kind of need to be genuinely clarified. I mean, one term that kind of worries me is the term memory. And it worries me for kind of two reasons. One, because I think there's a certain kind of confusion about the nature of memory. And secondly, it often seems kind of in the AA to be used as if it's an unmixed good. Anyone who kind of, is in favor of memory must be on the side of the ancients. Now, actually, I mean, by and large, I mean, even if that position were right, let's kind of we have to deal with the fact that that's a position which is, intrinsically and traditionally conservative. If one kind of thinks about, say, Nietzsche's analysis of German culture in the 19th century, his analysis about its weakness, about its incapacity to act creatively, is because it is dominated, burdened, and saturated by the question of memory. It sort of can't, to the point where kind of memory has become a kind of etiolating sickness. So, it seems to me that those issues are kind of still relevant, because anyone who talks about memory is also talking about the question of forgetting. And again, quite often in the AA, it kind of seems like forgetting is an absolutely terrible thing to do, except possibly keeping appointments. As if there is a preservation attached to memory, which is an unmatched good. So the first problem is, you need to think about what the ratio would be between, the claims on memory and, as it were, the claims which often relate to the future, which are about, what is it we need to forget in order that we can act. That's the first thing. The second thing is really that often the category of memory in sort of discussions at the AA itself doesn't seem kind of quite right. It's as if memory is thought to be the very simple preservation, in some sense, as if it's the same as the remembrance, as if it's the conservation of reminiscence. Now we know Freud talks, about hysteria as being a problem with reminiscences. Now, if you just kind of look, for example, at Freud's idea of the relationship between grief and memory, it seems to me a lot of what people here call memory is what Freud would call grief. That is to say, just to kind of summarize it very briefly, when if a loved one dies, Freud's argument is that the subject reacts to that immediately by identifying with the loved object completely. So that, as it were, the subject refuses to let the loved one die. Psychically, the loved one is kept alive for a while. And then, as it were, there comes a second stage, perhaps equally as painful within grief, which is the separation of the subject from the loved object. The sort of the painful unpicking stitch by stitch, the recognition that the person is dead and gone and is not the same as oneself. So immediately that someone dies, you might have someone who's always hated gardening, but their wife loved it, the wife dies. You immediately find during the first period of grief that person spends their time gardening in that moment of primary identification. The second stage is the unpicking, the separation. And at that point, Freud kind of notices that's when, say, organized religions like Judaism, will put a moment for the end of mourning, the setting of the stone, and the conversion of the person into memory. It's only then, after a separation has been made, that the register of memory is appropriate. Once that person has entered into memory, then, as it were, the Nietzschean question arises, do I wish to forget or do I wish to remember this person? It is, as it were, and something about which one has an important, a choice, one can make a principled kind of choice about it. So now it seems to me one of the problems with some of the discussion of memory is that what people are calling memory is the first identification. It seems to me when people call, say, the cinema the memory, actually it's not, it's the kind of grief bank of images. It's that which, in a sense, hasn't been separated from and worked through. Now, as I was trying to kind of argue this morning, there are images, though importantly, I don't think they're much to do with visuality, which resist being worked through, which continue to have a kind of negative and traumatic kind of effect upon the subject. So really, this intervention really is about two things. The question of memory shouldn't be taken as an unexamined good. It must be put into the question of forgetting, and I think the question of forgetting is related to the question of action. That's the first thing. And secondly, that the question of memory is when one has separated. When Pascal says, that a door is not a door unless it's the kind of memory of all that doors have been, or whatever. Now, I think what's curious about that position, it's almost a sort of Adam's architectural elements in paradise. It's not the house, it's, as if, as it were, one would not, that the correct door is the door that continues to store within it all the doors. And I suppose the question would be, what about the need to forget the door in order that it can be, in some sense, kind of refashioned? Which may be quite, a violent act of creation, but certainly is related to the question of the new. As Pascal rightly says, I would also link that to the re-establishment of a connection with something else from before, so it's not a simple point like, let's get rid of the past and do something new. But it is to pose this question of forgetting as equally as importantly as the question of memory. Otherwise, I think one just becomes a kind of a sort of melancholic memorialist in which gradually all objects in the world are transformed into memorials.
Augustinus says one doesn't forget that one has forgotten. So, for him, as I understand, it is so that there is the impossibility of forgetting.
Well, so
just maybe I'm afraid that my English English I couldn't go very far. Perhaps Jean Attali, who is philosopher too, could make. But I just wanted to say that you're right that there were different concepts of memory, of notions of memory, which were not discussed. But what seems to me important, and this is close to the Deleuzian-Bergson concept of memory, it's the link between perception and memory, and movement, and specific perception of time. And this is a very kind of materialist concept which has nothing to do with this psychoanalytic Freudian model, which was very physical too, of the Wunderblock, for instance, the memory as a machine. But perhaps you could explain better this Bergson-Deleuzian concept of memory, which just tries to explain the coexistence of different times of the past, the present, and the passing of the present, and the past, which is always past present and coexists as a virtual. I mean, in my English I can't explain it, but there's the virtual image which can never become a real image, and in cinema you just discussed some of these time images which can become memory, which can become memory images too, because of this coexistence of different layers of time. Perhaps you can just explain the difference, because you were critical about that.
If one tries to summarize very briefly the main statement of that in matter and memory, the statement or the assumption which supports the comments by Deleuze in the movement image, it is this affirmation that images are already developed in the things, within the things. And this philosophical position immediately overcomes the problem, the philosophical problem of representation. So to make images or to fabricate images is not to make representations of reality as removed from reality. To make images is to be involved in the way reality itself works. Because the brain is a part of reality, because the mind works as a part of the reality. Mind selects as a perceiver a part of those interactions of the already existing images. So, you know, to fabricate an image is not to fabricate a separated notion or picture of the reality. It's to deal directly with the reality. So I think that it's absolutely necessary to start from this point in order to understand the involvement of the cinema and the possibility of comparing philosophy with cinema or architecture with cinema. And the philosophy of time and the philosophy of memory are consequences from these first assumptions.
Understood. I mean, I think I follow and agree with most of what you're saying, but I didn't quite understand the argument against the physical in your understand the necessity of certain conditions of delay and postponement, but I don't understand the idea that there is in fact a possibility of not discussing it at all in some way. It seems, I mean, one of the things that there's J.W. Miller, who I think says things are always mental, but sooner or later, always physical. Somehow there seems to be a situation where you have to maybe address the relationship between these kinds of virtualities and the physical in some way. And I don't know in your theoretical argument, when is that moment and how is that to become?
First of all, I have to confess that I try to understand correctly the position Pascal has about physicality, because he has this habit of criticizing the involvement of architecture with physicality. But in the same time, he is the most committed architect I know with technicality, detailing, physicality of buildings. So I'm sure that his position is very thorough position about the involvement of architecture with materials, physicality, technicality, etc. So I think that Pascal has a very deep expectation about the effect of architecture, or about effect of materials, materiality, etc. So, as you know, the effect can be described as Stoician philosophers used to say, as an uncorporeal. The thing is materialized and embodied, but the effect is real but not corporeal. So I think that there is a sense, there is a possible perception of the specific effect of a well-done architecture. And it doesn't matter if we have to... There is, of course, a sort of nostalgia of physicality working underneath. But I think that the sense of the effect, the sense of the aim of architecture is the first thing Pascal wants to defend.
One of the things that was interesting this morning, and I think Mark touched on it, was somehow I thought the distinction between effect and affect. And one of the things that I think maybe came out that in Hans's film was that it was in a way dealing with very particular kind of architectural glasses. So maybe you have been dealing with this. Maybe you should say something. But I just felt that the affect and the kind of relationalities seem to be getting short shrift, and effect and tends to be prioritized over affect.
No, perhaps it's when we were talking about vertigo this morning, I was expecting more in the end because you were shortening your speech, and when you in the very moment you speak about the imago and the image, the imago which is beyond or before the images, that was the very moment, or the image as a wound, as a trauma. That was the very moment I was expecting more, to know more about it. You said one could look at that film, of course, in a psychoanalytical way and reviewing it that way, but this is not quite sufficient and not completely false. But I was terribly interested to learn and to know more about that idea of the image as you conceived it in the second part, as neither inside nor outside, just in between, and as a wound or as an open space or as an osmotic or deteriorated osmotic surface, and no longer as so kind of machine-produced thing.
I mean, it really has a kind of number of kind of different conditions. One is that on the one hand, I want to dispute the kind of emerging opposition between kind of image and, shall we say, structure, which I think is neither helpful to those who are trying to kind of think out structure, might drive them back actually unnecessarily to a sort of pure description of tectonics or something, you know, as the definition of the object. Nor do I think it helps those who are concerned with the analysis of images, because I think it reinforces the tendency to study the image according to a regime of visuality, purely, or psychoanalytically, in terms of the scopic, you know, all that somehow is to do with the eye. Now, on the one hand, I think that there are important psychic structures which can be described in terms of images. But as it were, they're images, I think, which belong to a slightly kind of special class. First of all, they're not objects in the visual field. And in respect to them, we're characterized usually by bumping into them, being blind in respect to them, but nonetheless, being what as is kind of, you know, open to intuition, being pierced by an image. I mean, what is it to be pierced by an image? It's not you're seeing something, you're pierced by an image. Now, it's this that I think might usefully be thought out through the category of trauma, whose topography is precisely as a wound, that it's neither inside nor outside, and therefore, but nonetheless, is profoundly kind of corporeal. It's the image, as I said, I mean, you know, could be thought of as like a branding or a tattoo. It's something kind of on the body, neither in nor outside. And this, I think, is the kind of register of the way in which one can begin to look at the power of images removed from all the common, you know, the common normal talk about we're being dominated by images, they flood us through the television or whatever. I don't think they flood us at all. I mean, I think most of all that's kind of hooey. And as I tried to suggest, you know, the available kind of theory, really, about images which are not about the scopic drive or visuality is really, you know, the tradition of thought about the icon. I mean, you know, if you think of all the issues that are involved in the Judaic or the Christian or the Islamic analysis of the icon and the positions, the characterizations of idolatry, of iconoclasm, you know, these aren't describing as it were, visual experiences. On the contrary, they're talking about the effects of images as the repetition of this kind of instance of what I'm calling kind of affect. I mean, I say it because, as it were, you know, polemically, the paper had wanted to draw the discussion away from the kind of normal kind of opposition between the two, which, as I say, I think is deleterious to both sides. I think that the cinema has much more to do with the body than we think. It's not just this kind of disembodied machine where somehow the projector and the eye are all working in a sort of analogous, you know, I mean, if you think of that whole history that Marx is so involved in, you know, in which the screen or the camera obscura stand in for a picture of subjectivity. The idea that the subject is a kind of representation machine. And I think there are various points from which that whole way of thinking is kind of beginning to sort of, in some sense, collapse. What one needs to do, I think, is to be able to link the question of the image, of affect, but to work out, like, the structure of it, almost obeying a kind of simple test. How far can you describe these relations without reverting to the visual and the scopic? There's nothing kind of wrong about that. It's just the question is, how far could you get? Now, once the image becomes studied in a sense as an element of bodily space, or systems of identification with bodily space, then, as it were, issues like projection become very literal spatial projection rather than, as it were, visual. I mean, the kind of projection which we restrict ourselves to in speaking of the screen. I mean, if in a sense, you know, one asks what is the barrier maybe between Pascal and a certain architectural realization, perhaps in a sense it's like the myth of the screen. It's the screen onto which something is projected rather than a real projection. Perhaps that's, as it were, the only bit left between him and architecture. But I doubt it. I'm sorry, I have to get to another conference. Sorry, that's it. No, that's for you to give to someone.
Thank you, Mark. No, I mean, I would like to make very clear I'm not against physicality. To say that once and forever. I'm very much for physicality, for materiality, but it is so precious for me that I would like that it is the decision about materiality is governed by another content which has for me to do with social life or communication of people. So if that is interrupted, like, let's say, through the Nazi door or anything else, then what is
He
Mark?
wants to give you a rebuttal. What are you going to say? Mark?
Just to Stalin says, agrees with someone, yes, freedom is incredibly precious.
Okay, sorry. I know that I'm naive, but I mean, I have certain experiences and certain memories, and out of that it comes, whatever, in which way one defines memories, I define them so from my experience. And then I look at, from my personal view, whether there are more people or the public or however one calls it who may have similar experiences, and then that's what I call memories, which I could possibly relate on. I know that that is like with everything else. There is no guarantee, no role that that's right, because it differs from the event to the event, or the context of materiality to process. But the other thing is that I think that architecture must allow the user the most of the possibilities, are not the architect. That is for me very, very clear. And I mean, when you talk to a painter, the painter says, all I need is white walls and not and rectangular shape, because it's the most neutral shape, it's the most cool or unemotional shape. So when we had Stephen Hawking here some years ago, he told me what he is interested in architecture is that he can, with his wheelchair, enter any place in the building, and whatever building, and in his workspace, the only thing he is really interested in is it's full of posters of Marilyn Monroe, because that's inspiration for perfection for him, what he thinks. That's how he said that. So, I mean, it comes to a certain point where the architect, as seeing himself as the governor of being the biggest artist in the world, and can do something to whatever. I mean, even a Frank Gehry, whom I like very much on a certain level, not everything he did, like the Paris American Center, I don't like, because it reminds me very much in the use of materials and combination of spaces on things I have experienced negatively. But I mean, what is he doing really? Okay, he can contribute to the appearance of a city by setting something against, let's say, a suppressive normal structure which may have come from economic low conditions, industrial conditions, where workers were nobody took care of workers, and those steel halls were just made to function somehow, and they express the suppression of the workers. So if he sets museum, the Guggenheim Museum, against that, in that way, that can be something which lifts possibly the image of the area, and possibly it does something to change the whole area. But in which direction? I ask myself. I mean, is that the direction which gives possibly people more freedom to act or to express themselves in a democratic, whatever democratic may be nowadays, way? I don't know. I don't think so. So when I think about image, when I think about construction, about designing, about processes, then I look for the means, I think, which from my experience and from reading and whatever, most appropriate for the different parts. So for life processes, especially in relation to spaces and of course, a representation in film or moving images only of physicality or materiality. It's expressed best. When I think of construction, I would look for reducing the materiality as much as possible and finding a solution which is as unsuppressive as possible. So not the 10-meter door, not the column which is so massive that one feels like a dwarf or so.
When people construct a narrative, a dramatic story in the film, they will often use absolutely oppressive physical presence. Somebody hits a wall, passes through an enormous arch. So architecture, in those cases, has a direct role in constructing the narrative.
Yeah, it's used as to express something, like the big door. It's used to show how small people could feel.
Your introductory text speaks about narrative, and I think that there's a sort of direct comparison between the construction of space and the construction of film narratives, which needs to be made, which could be very useful. To take the simple case of a preposition word like before. Before has both a spatial and a temporal meaning. It could be before you go into the building, or you can stand before the building. And if you're filming a character in bed, as it were, perhaps you see him before the air, then he goes to the door. Afterwards he's in the air. And the whole way that you might want to develop that would depend then on where you put your camera, how long you give outside, how long you give inside, and what kind of door he goes through. And in some sense the door is actually rather like a cinema shutter itself. And it seems to me that there is a long and really substantial analogies and comparisons to be explored in the field of editing and the construction of shooting scripts and planning
Sure.
of architecture.
Sure, I'm just suspicious of analogies. Because can an analogy be anything? What can it be? I mean, you see a door is in a way a shutter. Is it a shutter or is it a door? What does it mean? I think that's like Susan Sontag's against interpretation in a way that one, I mean, a door is a door. It does something, and it is not a cinema camera. It isn't. And I think this analogy or comparison for me is wrong from the beginning.
If you welcome someone in through the door, the point when you close the door, then it's like at the end of the shot. They're no longer outside, now they're inside. The door goes shut, and just like scissors go in the feedback editing machine.
Yeah, but that is a clear process, and it's not an analogy, or a misunderstanding.
Well, analogy.
I mean, you go into a door and you close the door, okay, and then with all our narrative memories, we say that's also meaning something else.
I just say that also Godot, I think, calls, for example, movement in images, like in film, analogy of movement. He describes movement in film as an analogy of movement. In other words, it is movement, it is that all will change. That like your analogy will change in, say, digital reproduction. It has changed. But, you may, although he's talking, I think, about metaphor rather than analogy, perhaps using metaphor, but I would say that an image is already something that refers to an original, at least, or a kind of external other reality in some point. So it's sort of in itself, it's not sort of registered or something.
In this question, I think, Pascal, is important to put whether a door is a door or not, or whether a door is anything other thing than a door. Barthes discussed it when he discussed photography and cinema, the significance of a photograph image, and of course, I think it's difficult to discuss like that when you don't speak about the specific film or film text. There's a very beautiful analysis made by Thierry Kuncel on Schötzak's The Most Dangerous Game, and here he shows that the significance of the doors, of course, because it's within a narrative structure, and it's because of doors, presentation of doors are repeated and are in a similar way put into the film, like the dissolve, which cut the film into sequences. So I think you can't decide it without speaking of about a very concrete sequence or film. The problem whether a door is the representation of a door is more than represents more than the door.
Yeah, but exactly, it depends on the context. What a door is, but otherwise you can only say a door is a door. I mean, except you put it in a context, but then that becomes something else than an analogy, I would say, because in the context of a story or narrative, the door becomes a very clear meaning in relation what role it plays in that narrative, but not as an analogy, but as a very clear thing.
But you already said something in your experience of the door, in the way that you use the door to evoke a particular memory. Already the door for you is already a loaded thing. It's not just a door, even in the way that you're using it to extrapolate from.
Absolutely, in a context of experience or narrative, yes. Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, there can be several connotations.
Sure.
But they never. This doesn't mean that this erases the first signification of the door. They can coexist.
Analogy as a way, in relationship to what Mark said, might be a way to forget. It's a way where you use an analogy not so much to replace or to like in kind of allegorical impulse in a way where you will replace one by one the element of the door by an element of a shutter. But it's almost like how to make that analogy break down, which is to say at which point, the door is, the shutter image makes the door not anymore a door but something else and replace it. So I think, analogy, and we probably do use analogy even if you don't like them, they are kind of theory in the same sense, which they try to bring something that in the first place may not be there yet. So then the door is not anymore a door, well, it's been a door, but it can become something else as well. And that's the purpose, I think, of analogy. Not, or a bit like Mark said this morning, when you invoke the name Mozart, it doesn't say anything, or when you say shutter, it doesn't say anything, but it's at the moment where the analogy breaks down, where the shutter doesn't kind of overlap with the door anymore, that there is something that happened. And that's the point where you forget or you see in a different way.
think that's not possible to separate image from physicality and materiality. I mean, those who are here today who are involved in filmmaking, I wonder if they would qualify the art as a non-material, non-physical art. And I suspect they wouldn't. I suspect they would find it very material and physical, but that's not for me to say. I mean, I think that light is only visible through dust. If there isn't dust in the air, you cannot see light. That's already a pretty direct relationship of that which can constitute an image of the question of visibility and materiality. And another dimension is the one of the use of images in describing materiality. And densitometry does nothing but that. If any of the lights that we see here are visible either are visible through the materials on which the light is projected from, which have those characteristics. Medical tomographic analysis does nothing but apply densitometric standards, references, in order to render one kind of materiality, bone, visible in relation to flesh, in relation to blood, and so on. And so the third part of the connection of image to materiality is the one of the memories. So it's very interesting that the memories have been described, I think, by all of us, beyond Marx's description of grief, in pretty material terms. And so for what might that mean for an architectural practice that develops is to begin to see this unit of memory, the image, from the cinematic to the architectural, afresh as a device used to measure and develop architecture. How to put that simply, I wonder if one could consider another process, maybe in another conference, where the builder be given a videotape instead of a drawing. I mean, because forgetfulness is involved in both. But what would be involved as a process from then on, and what would be the results of that, or the development, the potential development of that condition, which I think is likely to involve everything that has been said around this table.